Hello, I'm Marlene Saeed. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, energy prices are soaring. The head of the World Bank says it's enough to trigger a global recession by itself. So, is a contraction of the world economy inevitable? And which nations are most at risk? Also this week, the British government takes aim at expensive energy bills. Can the $19 billion aid package ease the squeeze on incomes? Or could the cost of living crisis get even worse? And Pakistan's teetering economy, the country with Asia's second fastest inflation rate, is seeking critical financing from the IMF. But can the Pakistani government implement the required reforms? The cost of almost everything, from food to fertilisers, is soaring, causing consumers to spend less. As governments aim to bring down the cost of living, containing inflation without pushing economies into a slowdown is difficult. And that's all while Russia's war in Ukraine and pandemic disruptions continue to constrain supply chains, darkening the outlook for the months ahead. So, should we be ready for a global recession? Well, the head of the World Bank has warned that Russia's invasion of Ukraine could cause a global recession. David Malpass told an event hosted by the US Chamber of Commerce that Germany's economy, the world's fourth largest, has already slowed significantly, while the US and China are also seeing slower growth. He added a fertilizer shortage could worsen economic conditions elsewhere. The World Bank has already cut its global growth forecast for this year by nearly a full percentage point to 3.2% from 4.1%. Well, the International Monetary Fund has also declined to rule out a global recession, but it says the world economy still has a cushion against contraction.
There are many headwinds to the global economy. The war could escalate. You could have sanctions and counter-sanctions. We have central bankers around the world tightening monetary policy. Financial conditions could tighten much more rapidly than we've already seen. And growth in China is slowing. So all of these pose downside risks to our forecast. So again, globally, I would say at 3.6%, there is a buffer. At the same time, there are countries that are getting hit hard. I mean, countries in Europe that are getting hit hard by the war, where we could certainly see technical recessions.
Now let's have a look at some of the recession factors cited by financial institutions. The MSCI World Stock Index fell more than 18% since a peak in early January. And there's been a sell-off in bonds, industrial metals, gold and crypto assets. China's GDP growth has slowed because of strict COVID-19 lockdowns. The country's retail sales fell 11% year-on-year in April, while industrial production was down 3% and unemployment is rising. The US is increasing interest rates and tightening its monetary policy to slow economic growth and bring inflation down. Meanwhile, Europe's households are suffering a cost of living crisis as prices rise much faster than incomes, limiting spending and the recovery from the pandemic. And the situation could be worse in many developing markets where fears of a food crisis are mounting. To discuss all of this, I'm joined now from New York by Megan Green. Megan is a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School and the global chief economist at the Kroll Institute. Thank you for joining the program, Megan. Now, the last global recession was brought on by the US subprime crisis 10 years ago. Are we entering similar territory?
No, so I think we're in a very different position from where we were before the global financial crisis. I spend all of my time looking for bubbles everywhere that could potentially burst. And it's actually hard to figure out where the exact bubble is. In part, everything's kind of a bubble, but I can't imagine any of them bursting in quite as spectacular a fashion as they did before the global financial crisis. That being said, we are slowing down pretty significantly in the US. The government is retrenching massively relative to last year. Rates are going up, so the investment environment is less conducive towards spending. Consumption is weakening, though that actually remains pretty strong. And the external demand picture, foreign demand is really weak, particularly as China is slowing significantly. There are a lot of worries that the US is going into recession, particularly because the central bank is hiking so aggressively. I actually don't think we need to worry about that in the next 12 months, mainly because of the health of the US consumer. And the consumer drives about 70% of growth in the US. Households have massive cash balances, so do businesses for that matter. There are 11.5 unfilled jobs in the US, so I can't see the labor market really deteriorating massively anytime too soon. That being said, the next 12 months, I think will continue to slow. The 12 months after that are when I think we need to worry about a recession as rates go up even higher.
Megan, the IMF has also said that the world economy still has a buffer against recession. Is that what you're referring to? Full employment, people's savings still intact, and so on?
That's right. So there is a huge cash buffer, particularly across the U.S. economy, given how big the stimulus measures were. The government pushed out $2.5 trillion into households' bank accounts. And so the bottom quartile by income of the U.S. has burned through that cash cushion, but the rest of America hasn't yet. And so I think there's a lot of space for people to go ahead and use their savings to spend and keep consumption up over the next 12 months. At the same time, companies use the opportunity during the pandemic to build up massive cash positions. So even though rates are going up and earnings are probably going down, the risks there are to the downside. They have big cash buffers to burn through before they really have to retrench. And it's when everybody has to retrench when we can expect a recession to come. So I think that's coming certainly down the line, but I don't think it's imminent. I don't think it will happen in the next year.
The buzzword seems to be stagflation at the moment, where countries face sustained periods of low growth but high prices at the same time. It's a very tricky combination, isn't it, for policymakers to tackle?
Yeah, it's every central banker's worst nightmare because central banks are supposed to try to support growth and demand, but also to lean against inflation and keep prices stable. So if you have an environment where you have very weak or virtually no growth and very high inflation, then central banks have to choose which one they're going to support rather than doing both. If they hike rates aggressively, they'll kill off growth, but we'll be able to bring inflation down. If they don't hike rates aggressively, then it supports growth, but inflation can become runaway. And that's a repeat of the 1970s as every central bank's worst nightmare. So stagflation is something to be avoided, to be sure. That being said, I don't think the U.S. is going to be in stagflation over the next year. I think the Eurozone is actually at the greatest risk of being in stagflation with incredibly weak growth this year and very high inflation. You
mentioned China. That's been under lockdown, which has weighed heavily on the global picture, growth picture. But they've started easing restrictions. Is that going to make a huge difference?
Certainly, it will help. We'll get a kickback in growth from China as Shanghai in particular is reopened. And then also more directly for the West in particular, all these factory shutdowns will be reversed. And so we can hopefully see an easing of some of the global supply chain snarls that we've been stuck with over the past at least year. And so that is one factor that's driving up inflation in the developed economies. And so if those factories stop shutting down, that should certainly help take some of the upward pressure off of inflation.
One of the other issues in developed countries we're seeing is countries imposing exports on goods like India, lately restricting the flow of sugar, Malaysia banning the export of chicken. Given the state of food protectionism, what is going to be the outlook for developing countries?
So I think that, we are absolutely facing a global food insecurity crisis in a lot of emerging markets, particularly in North Africa and the Middle East, will feel the squeeze because they're so dependent on imports for their food. I think we will see more export controls. Unfortunately, I think it's the wrong response. But given that we live in an environment of protectionism globally, I think it's the most likely response. If you impose export controls, of course, you're just imposing rigidities in markets. So you're not allowing markets to function and clear as they should. That ultimately just ends up pushing prices up higher. And that pushes inflation up even higher. But unfortunately, I think that's probably where we're headed unless the major food importers and major food exporters go ahead and agree that, the exporters just aren't going to impose export controls. So far, I don't see that kind of coalition coming together, that kind of announcement being made. It's what we should hope for, but I'm not particularly optimistic.
Megan Green, really good to talk to you. Megan, Senior Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you. The rising cost of everyday items has pushed inflation in the United Kingdom to its highest level in 40 years. Millions of Britons have seen their energy bills increase by at least 54%. That's an additional $863 a year on average for every household. The government has announced a $19 billion package to soften the impact of the cost of living crisis. Part of the money would come from a temporary windfall tax on the profits of oil and gas firms of around 25%. And the government says the measures would target the most vulnerable, including disabled people and retirees in particular. More than 8 million of the country's lowest income households will receive a one-time government payment of at least $800. That's in addition to around $500 discount on energy bills for every household. Well, the government help comes after the Bank of England has raised the cost of borrowing from a pandemic-era low of 0.1% to a 13-year high of 1%. This is in an attempt to rein in inflation. But despite the efforts to bring down the cost of living, a recent survey showed Britons can't afford to eat every day and are skipping meals as food prices rise. Neve Barker reports from London.
Trouble at the tills. The price of staple foods has soared in recent months, with as many as 2 in every 5 Britons now buying less to eat. And for the first time in 40 years, inflation, the gradual increase in the cost of goods and services across a year, rose to 9%, with the governor of the Bank of England warning of apocalyptic food price hikes. Further back the supply chain, the middlemen are trying their best to absorb the rising costs. This is London's biggest wholesale food market, where the industry is experiencing a perfect storm of problems, from the pandemic to Brexit, and more recently the war in Ukraine.
The crisis going on in Ukraine, with the floods going on in Spain, the various packaging costs, fuel costs. Brexit hasn't helped as well in terms of all the extra paperwork that has to be done. Who knows what's around the corner? You know, if the war continues, it's going to get worse. The winter's going to get worse. Look at what we're looking at now. You know, the cost of heating, the cost of electricity. It's all going up and up and up.
Russia and Ukraine are some of the world's largest producers of cooking oils, fertilisers and grains, used in everything from bread to animal feed. But the conflict means goods are stuck in ports or rotting in fields.
Producers and sellers are used to dealing with unpredictable situations, from low yields to economic pressures to supply chain problems. But rarely have the issues come this thick and fast, leaving no time for companies to recover, leaving everybody from field to fork counting the cost.
And what's a worry for wealthy Western consumers is potentially catastrophic for some of the world's poorest. In Somalia, already crippled by drought, the war in Ukraine's pushed fuel and fertiliser prices up by 40%, while in India, a decision to ban grain exports to protect domestic supplies threatens to push global wheat prices even higher. In the UK, the national dish, fish and chips, is the canary in the coal mine.
Oil's gone up, petrol's gone up, diesel's gone up. It all adds on to everything. And Joe Public's paying for it. We're all paying for it. And how much more can we pay for?
The cost of cooking oils increased 30% in 3 months, and cod and haddock are becoming more expensive as global warming's driving fish stocks further north, forcing fishermen to spend longer at sea. And now Russian fish has disappeared from the market. Industry bosses fear a third of the UK's fish and chip shops could close in the next 9 months. As the world bounces back from the pandemic, it's now out of the frying pan and into the fire.
Greg Swenson joins us now from London. Greg is the founding partner at London-based merchant bank Brigg Macadam. Thank you for joining the programme, Greg. What do you make of the new British household aid package? Is it enough to ease the cost of living crisis?
Well, Marlene, I don't think it's enough to ease it completely. It will surely help, and that's the problem with subsidies and these type of welfare payments or transfer payments. You know, they definitely ease the pain a little bit, or they definitely, will help lower income communities with the costs, the higher costs or the cost of living crisis. But it never solves the problem, and I think that's the problem, is that more spending, more subsidies will help in the short run, but actually creates more inflationary pressure in the medium and long term. And so that's inflationary in itself. So it's not a solution. I think it's unwise government policy.
Greg, the opposition also says that the measure is poorly targeted and will benefit those who are better off. Do you think that's fair?
I don't think it's necessarily accurate, Marlene. So it is targeted, and it does exclude people who make over a certain threshold. So I think the design of the strategy is compassionate because it's helping people that need it the most. Inflation by nature always hurts the people on the lower end of the income scale the most because they spend more of a higher percentage of their income on basics like food and energy. So it's always more hostile to lower income people. And that's where this is targeted. But A, it won't work in the long run in solving the problem. And B, they're not fixing the supply issue, which is really one of the factors that's causing inflation. But as I said earlier, printing more money to help people in the short run is compassionate, but it's not going to solve the problem and make inflation worse.
Boris Johnson's government has previously resisted windfall taxes. He said it's a deterrent for investment. So what's changed here?
Well, it is a deterrent, and I think we were all disappointed here in the UK to see the windfall tax announcement. I think there were some political pressures, with Partygate. They felt like there was a need to get maybe change the headlines from the focus on Partygate to something that's helping voters, and it is a vote getter. Welfare typically is, or government spending, it typically is. So, but the fundamentals haven't changed. The party right now, Boris and the Chancellor, sound more like Labour. That's what's changed, is that the Conservative Party is governing like they're not really conservative. And I think that's a big change.
The windfall tax in itself was a Labour idea, wasn't it? So let's look at the solution. We've seen the Bank of England increase interest rates 4 times in just the last 6 months in an attempt to contain the high and rising inflation. How much further do you expect interest rates to rise in order to get on top of this?
It's a great point, Marlene, and I expect rates will continue to rise. I mean, granted, there have been 4 increases, but they're very, very small in nature, whereas you've seen the Fed actually increase at a 50 basis points rather than the normal 25. So I think the Bank of England has been a bit too incremental. They have to do it a lot more. It really has to be to the point where the interest rates that they set are above the inflation rate. Right now, they're below the inflation rate. Inflation came in at 9%. We expect it to go to 10%. And as long as rates are lower, that is what we call negative real rates, where the actual inflation-adjusted rates are still below zero, and that's the case now. So in many ways, it's too little too late. They have to do more.
The cost of living crisis is happening all over Europe, elsewhere in the world. How much worse do you think it's going to get in the UK, and especially with attempts to get less dependent on Russian energy? Are they going to be able to deal with it?
Yes, in many ways, UK is in a better position than the rest of Europe because they were only buying 3% of their natural gas, for example, from the Russians. It was very easy for the UK to stop buying any energy products from or energy supplies from Russia, whereas the dependency is much greater in the rest of the continent. We have all talked about Germany, importing 40% of their nat gas and a significant amount of their energy overall. So I think the challenges will be greater in Europe. As you mentioned, the Bank of England has at least started the process of raising rates, whereas the ECB is way behind. They haven't indicated that their first hike will be until July. It's way too little, too late.
Greg Swenson from London-based merchant bank Brigg McAdam. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Molly.
Soaring inflation, a high current account deficit and foreign exchange reserves barely enough to cover 2 months of imports. Pakistan is struggling to keep its economy afloat, raising the prospect that one of the world's most populous nations could soon follow Sri Lanka and default on its debt. Leaders are seeking to revive a $6 billion bailout package from the International Monetary Fund to help pay the bills. Well, Pakistan needs more than $36 billion in financing for the fiscal year starting June. And the government has increased the cost of petrol by 20% to pave the way for a deal with the IMF. The Prime Minister has been reluctant to end energy subsidies and roll back unfunded subsidies to oil and power sectors, which are key demands by the IMF. The measures could hurt Pakistanis' wallets and spark a public backlash at a time of political instability. Well, the decision to increase fuel prices comes a day after the two sides ended week-long talks without reaching an agreement to revive the stalled loan. Al Jazeera's Osama bin Javed spoke to the country's finance minister, Miftah Ismail, who was holding discussions with the IMF in Qatar's capital, Doha.
Pakistan continues to face a depleting foreign reserves, a spiraling currency, and a current account deficit which continues to rise. And those are the challenges that a month-old government is facing while facing unrest on the streets in Pakistan. With us to discuss it is the Finance Minister of Pakistan, Mr. Miftah Ismail. Thank you very much for speaking to us. You've been in talks with the IMF. What have you achieved and where is Pakistan headed?
We've talked about this year's budget, we've talked about next year's budget, and in particular we've talked about petrol subsidies that the previous government had given against an agreement with the IMF. And we've talked about how to resolve those things, how to unwind the subsidies and how to move forward in the coming year.
So now the crux is that unless you remove those subsidies, unless you exponentially increase the price of petroleum products, as well as some tax issues in Pakistan, the IMF is not going to continue its program. And that jitters confidence from other investors in Pakistan, other lenders to Pakistan as well. How are you going to build that confidence? Because your government seems to be facing a lot of resistance and it might be on its way out.
First of all, I mean, let me just say that there's a broad-based consensus in Pakistan amongst all political actors that the IMF program has to continue and that whatever necessary changes that we need to make, in particular to pass on the real prices of these foreign imported commodities, oil and diesel, etc., that we have to pass this on to the consumers. And that's a broad-based agreement, even including opposition parties. That said, I mean, they may do politics with it, but that's a consensus. So, it doesn't really matter whether I stay as finance minister or somebody else comes in as finance minister or whether our government stays or not. We will continue to work with the IMF, and I'm pretty sure that we will very soon reach an agreement with the IMF with our government in place.
And now the situation in Pakistan seems to be precarious at best, where your government is being accused of heavy-handedness, political activists are being rounded up. How are you going to stabilize Pakistan when you're not letting the democratic spirit stay on the streets of Pakistan?
Oh, that's absolutely not true. We are absolutely not going to disrupt democratic demonstration or disrupt peaceful democratic demonstration. But when somebody, as you know, that we have police have caught arms, and arms, in cars of political opponents. So as long as PTI promises to be peaceful, I think they will be allowed. And in fact, I think the courts have allowed them to demonstrate peacefully. But they don't have the right to disrupt life. They don't have the right to occupy central government offices. They don't have the right to occupy main boulevards to disallow us to go to offices. But other than that, I mean, Imran Khan has been doing one rally after another in the last month, and he's welcome to go around Pakistan and speak his mind.
Very quickly, you're a few weeks away from presenting the first budget of this government. Very difficult economic decisions to be made. How confident are you that you are going to present a budget which is going to be people-friendly when you're facing an increase in inflation, an increase in commodity prices, increase in energy prices? What is your plan?
Well, I mean, we think that in the next 3 to 4 months, we are going to get a handle on these increased prices. And that with the tight monetary policy that we have and a slightly consolidating fiscal policy, we will get hold of inflation. We will, control inflation. And once that happens, then we can, loosen the monetary policy and allow growth again to flourish. So I think we have a plan. We've worked with the IMF. We've reached, some conclusions about where we want the economy to be headed. And in very short period of time, you will see both an agreement with the IMF and a budget which is inclusive, which targets subsidies towards the poor, and which will not leave anybody behind.
And that is our show for this week. Get in touch with us by tweeting me at Marlene Said, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or drop us an email, countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Marlene Said from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.